and welcome to Season 5 of Teaching Matters, a podcast from the Psych Sessions Network. I'm Eric Landrum from Boise State University, one of Teaching Matters' 3 co-hosts. My other 2 co-hosts are Susan Nolan from Seton Hall University and Adeyinka Akinseler-Smith from City College of New York. And we do say goodbye to another co-founder of this podcast, Asani Sewell, in episode 6 of this Season 5. These 10 episodes of Season 5 were recorded from July 2022 through March of 2023 and are released on 10 consecutive Saturdays in 2023, starting on March 18th and continuing through May 20th. Oh, the places we'll go. We'll open with a current discussion of AI and ChatGPT. Then we'll harken back to mid-2022, where we had multiple conversations with different members of the Society for Teaching of Psychology, that's STP, and different task force leaders about their work. We'll chat about career transitions and changes, one time generically and one time specifically, as podcast co-founder Asani Sewell joins us, sadly, for the last time as a regular and discusses her departure from the podcast. In the remaining episodes, we discuss other classic topics that are, yes, beyond teaching. How do we handle students and other professionals and how they address us? We talk about the rituals of higher education and how they relate to our regular daily lives, with special meaning for Eric. A discussion about the special skill of peer reviewing, and then a discussion about applying for honors and awards. Why it's good for you, your department, and why you should apply as a role model, even if you think you might not receive the award. It's all part of the knowledge and skills that psychology professionals need to know about, the stuff that we are not taught in graduate school. That is, beyond teaching. Welcome to Season 5. Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Teaching. We are thrilled to be here with our kind of new dynamic trio. I am Eric Landrum from Boise State University. I'm going to let my dear friends introduce themselves.
And I am Yinka Akinseler-Smith from the City College of New York.
And I am Susan Nolan from Seton Hall University in New Jersey.
And Susan, we were just chatting before Yinka hit record. I think you've got a really great topic that is timely for a lot of faculty that you wanted to bring up with us today.
So I saw on Facebook in the column that the professor is in. She's an academic who answers kind of questions about academia. She also runs The Professor Is Out, about people thinking of leaving academia. But on one of her threads, I think at this point, it was a couple of months ago, she talked about she had pushed back on something and had written to people, and then they went straight to calling her by her first name as opposed to Dr. So-and-so or Professor So-and-so, which it then led to a really interesting conversation. And one of the things that surprised me, because I did not know this, was people were saying, oh, if you're going to change to first name, you should say, instead of, Dr. Akinseler-Smith, I would say, Dear Yinka, if I may, in parentheses or something like that. And I'd never heard about this, if I may. And so I feel like, have I been spending my whole career? If somebody wrote to me, like, let's say to ask me to do an external letter for promotion in another institution, and they wrote to me, Dear Dr. Nolan, blah, 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 best George, I'd be like, well, they use George. So I would say, Dear George. I would never say if I may, because and then I'll sign it Susan. So anyway, what did either of you think about that? Have you thought about it? What do you do?
You know, it raises a really interesting question. And I know we'd been talking a little bit about it before we started, but as you were just talking about it now, I also started thinking about, and not to make this even more complicated than it already is, about issues around culture and respect for elders. So I come from a culture where, somebody is an educator, somebody has a title, you call them by their title. So in Sierra Leone, it would be doctor or professor. It would never be, calling someone, especially a student speaking to a faculty person, calling them by their first name. I mean, you would just not do it. But then here in the US, I've come to learn that things are a little more relaxed. I mean, even with my students, it is, I keep it that way. When I was in school with my advisor, it was when he invited me to call him by his first name that I began to call him by his first name. But with this generation, I guess people are a little more forward. But then when it comes to the emails, as you mentioned,
And
um,
I'm talking with colleagues.
with even with colleagues, when I've received an email from someone, I've always my first go-to is to, especially if it's someone I don't know, is to use their title. And then if they have written to me and then used my title but signed it off with their first name, then I will also, use their first name and then use my first name.
Okay. So I think we do the same thing because if I'm writing
Yeah.
to somebody that I don't know or don't know well, I will
Yeah.
use doctor or professor.
But
But
if I may, that's
yeah,
interesting. I
yeah,
had not thought about that before. I
I
don't know, Eric, what do you do?
yeah,
Yeah, but you've both identified it's multi-layered. Depends on your familiarity with another professional. I think it varies on whether you're corresponding with undergraduates or graduate students. I think what also confuses it in my department, we're undergraduate only, but a couple of faculty members immediately invite students to call them by their first name, but faculty members want much more formality. And we also know that this is a gender issue
Hmm.
because unfortunately, we have students who will say Mrs. Smith, but Dr. Landrum.
yeah,
And I will tell you, rightly so, it really pisses off Mrs. Smith.
yes, been there.
Yeah, and I will say, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have decided to cut that at its knees I go by Dr. Yinka. I mean, my last name is very long, so people get confused. It's
Right.
also something for me that came from my father, who was also a psychologist, who went by Dr. Akin, because his first name was Akin Sami Akin Shulure. So he went by Dr. Akin to make everything easy. And so I kind of, when I became a doctor, adopted the Dr. Yinka to just make things easier for everyone else and less aggravating for myself.
So I think with students, I think it's good to telegraph what we expect. Like when we go into the classroom,
Yeah.
just, because they're guessing and most of them don't want to be accidentally
Yeah.
offensive. And so uh y- just tell them I want to be addressed Dr. Landrum, or if something else, whatever that something else
Right.
is, but also let them know my preference doesn't necessarily match my colleagues. So
Mm.
if you have two other psych classes this semester, if the instructor doesn't say it on day one in class or over Zoom or whatever, be sure to ask. Now, with professional correspondence, if you don't know the person, I think it's always safest to err on more formality.
Mm.
Yeah.
But I don't think in my career I've used "if I may." I have always cued off of Susan kind of what you have, and I think you have too, Yinka, which is after a couple of back and forths, if they've signed with their first name and I've signed my replies with my first name, I would never sign my reply Dr. Landrum to a colleague, even one I don't know. I
Mm.
would sign it Eric.
Same,
Um,
Yeah.
same.
Ditto.
I
then,
always sign things best, Eric.
well, that's going to be really confusing in your course. I got to say that for
I
sure.
realized you had said I was signing
Uh,
Eric, and I said me too.
When I
And
sign it R. Eric Landrum, that just sounds pretentious when I
no,
sign my emails like that. Um,
no,
the,
yeah, I
the thi-
always use my first name. Yeah,
yeah, and then eventually I might say, dear, dear George, I will not be able to provide the external review letter you requested. If we've gone back 3 or 4 times, if we've only gone back and forth once or twice, there's no point. Dear Dean Jones or whatever.
any other
Well, I just think it's
bad or
best to err
advice?
on formality. At least
So
that's where I land in my generation. I understand other generations might see it differently. I can appreciate that.
So I just want to throw one more wrench in. I did have a case once where it was a colleague whom I had met, didn't know well, and he continued to write to me, "Dear Susan," and sign Dr. So and so. And I was, following that and like, okay, he wants to be called Dr. So and so and signing Susan. And after a while, it just felt like, you know, was there a gendered element? I mean, he was, in terms of years in academia and age, I was older and more senior also. So, that was a weird case. And I wondered if I could have said, dear, Joe, which is not his name, if I may. I mean, that might have been a place to use that.
I think you, if someone is purposely ignoring the cues, then I think you do that. I think at least you say, "Hey Joe, thanks for your email." Um, and then you sign your email SN.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Dr. N.
Hmm.
I mean, my emails to students, I sign EL.
Yeah. I mean, if students are working with me in my lab after a while and I know them well, I'll start signing SN.
Of course. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we have a culture in our department where the undergrads call us doctor, professor. And we had a grad program until recently, and the graduate students call us by our first name. And we sort of talked about this as a department, and certainly you could deviate if you wanted, but that's just what we all did. And it made things a little bit easier to have a norm.
It really is handy for students if there is a norm, but out at the same time, they ought to be able to handle individual differences.
Right.
And I think I really agree with what you said earlier, Eric, that, if we know what our preference is, we make it known from day one.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
put it in the syllabus. You when you're introducing yourself during your first lecture, your first meeting, you make it clear to them that this is who you are. And this is, in terms of respect, this is what you would like to hear from them. You're very clear that
Right.
that makes things so much easier. But
Don't
that's when you're
make
working
students
with them.
guess.
Right.
Don't make students guess and then be offended when they guess wrong.
Right.
Wrong. Right.
Yeah. I also love Yinka's advice of cultural differences and differences across countries, and both countries and culture. And I'm part of a couple of international collaborations right now, and some new folks are coming in. So I'm going to definitely keep that in mind and kind of really pay attention to try to pick up on what they want to be called.
And Susan, I think, didn't you offer a tip a few years ago for people who have what might be challenging names to pronounce at first? Didn't you offer a tip that there was a little program you can add in your email sign off that you could click on it and it was a pronouncer? Didn't you forward a tip from like a website?
Oh, that wasn't me, but I recently saw a pronouncer for Chinese names, which is really handy. Somebody had shared that.
Yeah. So if we have colleagues out there who are constantly getting their names mispronounced, I think it's really handy to have, um, I think it's really handy to give some tips other than beyond the first day of
Oh,
class when you say
I
your
see what you're
name.
saying. I know what you're talking about. Yes, I have a program that I use that my students record a video of themselves, and
Ah.
they say their name, and I tell them explicitly, this is because I want to A, get to know you, and B, I want to know how you say your name and what you want to be
Yeah.
called if it's not the name that I have on my roster.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think faculty can do some help. And I think there are programs out there, like if you have a footer in your emails, it's part of your automatic sign off.
Yeah.
There's a hyperlink to a pronouncer.
Hmm.
You have the type of name. I have a
Like
colleague.
my name.
Well, well, you just have to practice. Like any name, you have to practice it. And once it's practiced, oh, go ahead.
But you have to know what's going on, because there's certain, like, you see the first part of my last name, it looks like you would say Akin Sulure, but actually in Yoruba, there's a dot under the S and there's a dot under the E. The dot under the S signifies sh sound, and under the E, eh. So it looks like you could do it, but it just gets a little complicated. And I actually say to students when, because I also, no matter how big my class is, well, I mean, the largest is usually in the 40s. I go through and I like to be able to say their names. And I say to them, I know because I have a complicated name that can get butchered, and I want to make sure I'm saying your name the correct way. So I encourage them to correct me.
Yeah.
And not everybody has the time for that, but that's okay too.
I don't know. I actually think it's important to make a little bit of time to say the names correctly.
I do think it's important. And I might not have thought this, I'll be honest, my whole career. But I do think more recently, I've understood that names are important and pronouns are important.
Yeah.
And I don't think everybody has to display their pronouns. There's reasons why some people don't want to, but I think this is important stuff. It's worth educators' time and effort to get it right.
Yeah. And I do see some people on their Zoom screens putting the pronunciation of their name. And one example is Vijay Sathi, who's well known in the teaching of psychology community. Her name, Viji, sometimes people say Viji, but it's Viji. And so she puts the pronunciation there, which I think is a really a helpful thing.
I think it might be Vigi who also posted at one point on social media about the name pronouncer in the email footer
Mhm.
too,
Mhm.
about the little program that can rest there.
That's very cool. Well, great. This was a really great discussion, and I am going to be more culturally aware, but I also feel like I've been validated in switching to first names if the person is signing off their first name without having to say, if I may. And if anybody who's listening disagrees, please email me because I would love to learn more.
And
Thank
I
you
just
for
want to
listening.
say, oh, no, go ahead.
Go.
I just want to say thank you to both of you for being so respectful during this episode, if I may.
Well, I guess you may.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.